She took me aside one time and, she said, if you're caught, never admit to the thing. I don't care what they tell you they saw, what they think they know, just deny it. They don't want to believe it. Just give them a reason to not believe it, was her advice to me. And I remark in the book, I said, I'm sure she meant well. But the main point is that she thought that was advice that I was going to need. That the normalization of the infidelity as simply a part of what people do, and not condemnatory, not shameful, simply an aspect of life. And by the way, if you're going to go that way, and I expect you will, this is advice that you should have. Deny everything. And I made good use of that advice.
Welcome to the Unspeakable podcast. I'm your host, Meghan Daum. My guest this week is almost certainly no stranger to my listeners. He is the economist and academic Glenn Loury. You probably know Glenn from his long-running podcast, The Glenn Show. He's also the Merton P. Stoltz Professor of the Social Sciences and a professor of economics at Brown University, where he's taught since 2005. He's a fellow at the Manhattan Institute and has had a fascinating life. Glenn grew up on the south side of Chicago and eventually became the first Black professor of economics at Harvard and a prominent conservative intellectual. The Glenn Show has been running since 2012. Can you believe that? And features conversations with various thinkers about public policy, education, and race. Glenn's regular conversations with John McWhorter have been foundational to the emergence of the intellectual sphere, often called the heterodoxy. And as I've written about, they were my gateway drug into this realm. Anyway, Glenn has published numerous books, but his new one is a massive departure. It's a memoir called Late Admissions, Confessions of a Black Conservative. And it's not just an account of his professional trajectory, but it's an absolutely unflinching interrogation of his personal choices, many of which are going to shock some readers, probably. Suffice to say, there's a lot of sex and drugs in this book. In addition to economic theory, Glenn is equally unflinching in this interview, which I must say I found delightful and riveting. It's so good that I'm not paywalling any of it. I will say that paying subscribers got to hear it about a week early. Lucky them, and now lucky you, and lucky me that I got to have this conversation with Glenn Loury. Glenn Loury, welcome to The Unspeakable.
Thank you, Meghan. Good to be here.
I think it was a little over a year ago. You must have been in the thick of writing or maybe revising, I don't know, this memoir, Late Admissions, Confessions of a Black Conservative. And in one of your conversations with John McWhorter on The Glenn Show, you talked about working on the book, and you talked about this motif of the cover story versus the real story. And I don't know if you remember, I was so excited by this that I actually stopped the podcast and I immediately emailed you because I wanted to send you my own book, The Unspeakable, that also wrestles with this dichotomy. And you very graciously agreed to receive it and you read it. Having now read your book, there's so many things I want to talk about, but let's start right there with that device, the cover story versus the real story. When did that come into the picture in terms of working on this book?
Wow. I don't know for sure exactly what was the moment of flash of insight or something like that. I'm not sure it was quite like that. I think it may have come more out of a recollection and a kind of retrospective on my process of coming to terms with the writing of this book, which was I had to discover for myself the stories that I was telling myself that were covering the real issue at hand, whatever the thing might be, my faith journey, I'm believing in Jesus or I'm not, my marital infidelity, what am I actually doing in my relationship with this woman, my conservative political beliefs, and to what extent are they affected on behalf of some other motivation, or my liberal at a different point in my arc, political beliefs, and likewise, my relationships with my father, my mother, my children, all these different aspects and many more, where I realized I had kind of told myself a cover story. I had told myself an account that obscured rather than revealed or clarified. And that there was real value for myself, in my own self-understanding, seeing that and moving beyond it. And as I composed the text of this book over the anguished months, I came to see that that was, something that was of more general value, that, maybe my parents had told themselves cover stories about things, and maybe my political colleagues had some cover stories of their own that were, whatever. But it didn't come at one moment, Megan.
You could have taken the easy way out here, though. I mean, this could easily have been a book, and it would have still been incredibly fascinating because you have a fascinating life. It could have been about growing up with the family you did and, south side of Chicago, having a young marriage. You were a teenage father. You married the mother of your children, and you go on to have this incredible career. And the double life aspect, you could have just limited it to, I'm trying to straddle two worlds. I've got one foot in, the place I grew up, and I've got the other foot in this, incredibly high level intellectual, political kind of sphere. But you didn't do that. You were really unflinching. And so I guess I'm curious, did you want to write a memoir, or did somebody come to you and say, you should write a memoir?
No, I wanted to write, and I've been wanting to write for a decade. I started out saying, "Oh, I'm going to write." I mean, I have the podcast. I spout off and talk about myself sometimes, and floated this idea that I was going to write a book. I was going to call it "Changing My Mind," and it was going to be about I used to be on the left, and I was on the right, then I was on the left, and I was on the right. Political journeys, breaking ranks. I think Norman Podhoretz.
Yeah, these are all the titles of books that already exist. Zadie Smith has a book called "Changing My Mind." So.
Okay. Well, that title wasn't going to work anyway.
Okay.
So I had this idea. I've got a story. I also have all this scandal and trauma and whatnot. I was up for a big job in the Reagan administration. I was a big time professor at Harvard, going to state dinners at the White House and being buddies with politicians and so on. And a Black conservative, notorious, infamous, but whatever. And then I end up being accused of assaulting a younger woman with whom I was having an affair. And it blew over in time, but at the moment when that accusation was made, I was a potential felon. I was humiliated. I had to withdraw from the government job. I was scandalized. And not long after that, I was caught on the streets of Boston with cocaine in my possession, and had to go into drug rehab, and had a terrible problem with addiction, and fought it and beat it in the fullness of time. But so I had all this drama, so I have spectacle, and I thought, well, that's worth writing about, except I just couldn't get it written. It didn't happen. Then there was a second, a few years later, I took a leave 2015-16 from Brown. I was out at the Center for Advanced Study in the Behavioral Sciences at Stanford. And on my year's leave, my project was to write a book that I was calling The Enemy Within.
Mm-hmm.
So now the ground has shifted a little bit from the political to the personal, and from the narrative of a wayward, public intellectual to something that's more confessional and self-regarding and self-examination and self-exploration. And that was a separate thread of an idea about what I was trying to do in the book, not just saying how it is I used to be a conservative and then not so much, but saying, who is this guy and why? I had started asking myself this question, why? And that proved to be a much richer vein. And in the fullness of time, I've been able to mine it.
Yeah, you have so many great lines, but one of my favorites was, you say, the problem of self-regard becomes most insidious when one thinks one has put it to rest. And I think that you're self-interrogating throughout this book. And it's interesting that you call it confessions, because when I teach students, I like to talk about the difference between confessing and confiding. And I really felt like you were confiding in your reader. And it didn't feel like you were kind of just dumping a bunch of stuff on us. You were really sort of whispering in our ear. I mean, and of course, I want to get to some of the instances you just mentioned. I think it was in 1986, 1987, you were a candidate for U.S. Undersecretary of Education in the Reagan administration. And then you had this incident with a woman named Pamela Foster. And then you had this drug charges the next year. But before we get to that, let's back up. So tell us about your family, for starters. You have, pretty, for all of its dysfunction, you've got, in some ways, a pretty nice childhood. You've got a loving family, you have friends, you have a really formidable Aunt Eloise, who's an important person in your life. Tell us kind of what the cast of characters is here.
Yeah, she pronounced it Elois.
Oh,
Aunt Elois. And in the opening chapters of the book, I talk about my coming up in Chicago on the South Side in the 1950s and 60s, and about my mother, about my father. They were divorced relatively early, my sister. And my mother and my sister and I were a household who moved in to a small apartment upstairs and in the back of a grand house that my aunt Elois and her husband, my uncle Mooney, owned. And that's where I grew up through like fifth grade through high school. And I wasn't poor. It was a single family home in a residential neighborhood that was quiet with lawns well kept in the front, fruit trees in the yards in the back, and small scale apartment buildings and single family dwellings lining the avenue. I didn't hear gunshots as a kid. I didn't find, used hypodermic needles in the gutter. I wasn't worried about being mugged or shot in the drive-by, anything like that, anywhere near where I was living as a kid. I left my bicycle in the backyard lawn sometimes without worrying that it would be stolen. The neighbors were middle class, working class, some professionals, most of them skilled laborers with jobs or public servants of one kind or another. Relatively stable families and a relatively, good environment. I mean, that was the cover story anyway.
mhm.
Down underneath, there was a lot of stuff that was going on, and I talk about it in the book. But so it was complicated, and there were various struggles and challenges, and there was some pathology and the kind of forerunner of the problematic behavioral dynamic that we associate with inner city African American culture could already be seen a little bit in some of the aspects of the social location that nurtured me. But yeah, it was, my uncle Mooney was a barber and small businessman. He and my aunt had run a dry cleaner for some years before she retired because she adopted a foster family of four children to raise as her own. When I was 10, 12 years old, they came to live with us in that big grand house of my auntie Lois's. But until she did that, she kept a dry cleaning establishment, and they hustled to make ends meet. There was enough to go around, but perhaps sometimes just barely enough. My father and my mother, they divorced when I was quite young, but he worked his way through undergraduate college at night, had to drop out when my mother became pregnant with me. They were both young, still in college. He dropped out and then ended up going back at night and got a law degree from a local law school, built a career in the Internal Revenue Service as an accountant and manager, and retired at the top of the rank as a director of a large income tax processing center in Kansas City. So he had a good career with the Internal Revenue Service. It was a part of my life, though I didn't live with him after I was like 3 or 4 years old. I got a decent education in the public schools of Chicago. Once my mother settled down and we moved in with my aunt, I was in the fifth grade. I had attended five different schools before finally settling down and getting some stability in my life. And I flourished in school, was a bright kid, and finished high school at a public high school in Chicago, where I got exposed to good teachers in literature and in math and in social science and in the languages. And it was a good preparation for me. And I ended up, it's a long story, and I'm not going to try to tell it all here. But I ended up finally, after bouncing around a little bit, at Northwestern University as an undergraduate. But by then, I was a father and a husband. But in any case, I finished up with a scholarship there that allowed me to take full-time courses, even though I had to work as well to help to support my family. And I did very, very well there, and ended up getting recruited to graduate school at one of the very best departments in the world at MIT in those years, and became an academic. That's the condensed version. But I grew up on the south side of Chicago in relatively auspicious circumstances. Yes.
So, on one hand, you were a superstar, academically gifted, ambitious, just championed by teachers and professors. And on the other hand, you were given to a level of a kind of self-sabotage that really intensified over the years. And I feel like I'm interested in kind of exploring the pattern. I mean, one of the first examples you give was when you, I guess, quote unquote, borrowed a car that was kind of sitting around in a local, I don't know if it was in a body shop or someplace. And, you had the best, you the best of intentions behind this. You were going to borrow this so you could take your date to the prom. And this ended up being your first arrest, did it not?
It did. And yes, I was anxious to impress my date. And I thought the car would be perfect for our necking, we called it, for some hugging and kissing in the back seat, parked on a quiet lane over in the park somewhere after the ball. So I had big plans for that car. And yeah, it was a really dumb idea. The car was sitting in the lot, unlocked, of a service station. It was being worked on, and apparently, whatever was wrong, the ignition didn't require a key in order to start the vehicle. You could just turn it with your hand, and it would start. And some younger kids playing around had discovered this, and they were having fun with it. And I heard about it, and so when no one was looking, I went over there. I got in this vehicle, and I drove without a driver's license or any real experience driving a vehicle. I drove it off the lot and parked it somewhere on a side street, and savored the opportunity to use it to impress this girl. What a dumb idea! As I say this to you, I'm thinking
It was so well thought out. There's so much detail in the plan.
Yeah. So of course I get stopped by the police because it's been reported stolen by the owner, and I never get to the girl's house to pick her up to take her to the prom. I stand her up on prom night, which is unforgivable. And I get taken to the police station where they assume that I'm a part of some auto theft ring, and they want to interrogate me about who I'm working with.
Oh.
And finally, one of the officers, this is not even in the book, comes over and says, "Oh, this is just some stupid kid who took the car on a lark." Because I was dressed in a tuxedo, and I was 17 years old. I mean, I was not exactly your prime suspect for auto theft, material. And my father came and bailed me out, and told me a story about his wayward half brother, who he said the last time he was in a police station was to get out his wayward half brother, who was notorious for being a fuck up. And, that was the last thing I wanted to hear from my dad, whose respect I'd be trying to earn pretty much all of my life. But yeah, that happened. And it went on my record. And when I finally went to work at a printing plant a couple of years later, and they asked me, did I have a criminal record? I said no. And they discovered this and could have let me go, for lying at the entry point.
Yeah.
But I had impressed a couple of people, and they decided to give me a second chance. And thankfully, they did because I needed that job.
Yeah. So, I mean, we don't have to go down too much in the weeds here, but we should say you went to a technical college. Was it the Illinois Institute of Technology in the
Yeah,
beginning?
the Illinois Institute of Technology. Yeah.
Okay. And then, so you had, when you were 17, I think you had a girlfriend or a girl you were involved with, and she was 15 and she ended up getting pregnant and you married her. It's funny. I was kind of reading up on you a little bit, and I stumbled on a story that was kind of giving it might have even been in like the Brown Daily Herald or something when you first went to Brown, and it was kind of giving this overview of your career, and it described this point in your life as like you had gone to school, but then taken some time off to start a family. I think that's how they had phrased it, and having just read the book, what we know. So that was the cover story there. Thank you, Brown Daily Herald. And then but what we know is that you were really young, and this was not even really somebody you were in, it was not a great romance, and you were under pressure to, get married. You did do the right thing. You married this girl. You were living with her family. This is not a good situation for anybody. You go from Northwestern to MIT. You eventually go to Boston. And pretty soon you find yourself really literally living a double life. Can you explain what started to happen around that time?
Well, I got bored. I wanted action. I cultivated the habit of cruising, going to bars, picking up girls, smoking weed, acquiring weed, and hanging out in the hood. I'm at MIT. I'm a graduate student, and I'm living in Cambridge, Massachusetts. But Roxbury, Dorchester, Mattapan, Jamaica Plain, these are neighborhoods in Boston where, one could find things to do. And so I had this habit of entertaining myself on the dark side, on the wrong side of the line. The spontaneity, the excitement, the thrill of illicit pleasures, not unknown to me from my days at the Illinois Institute of Technology as a college student straight out of high school before my first wife, Charlene, became pregnant with our first child. When I was 16, 17 years old, and I had buddies who were first year students at IIT as well. Some of them, one kid from New York City named John had a car, and we would go cruising. We'd drive up from the IIT campus. We'd drive south along State Street to the Robert Taylor homes, projects, and see who's hanging out and what's going on. And again, looking to pick up girls, looking to cop herb, and hanging out with people sitting on the street playing their boom boxes and drinking and whatnot. We were experiencing the thrill and the excitement of life on the street in inner city Chicago neighborhood amongst Black people. Although we were living, John was literally living on campus. I was at that time. It was before Charlene and I came together. I was living with my mother, but we were living on both sides of the line.
So, what were you thinking, or even how conscious were you, if at all, of what was really going on with this? Like, there obviously was some kind of need. It's almost like you had this, cognitive dissonance is putting it mildly, but as I was reading, my impression is like, okay, this person has come so far in such a short amount of time, and it must just be intolerable to live in this new world full time. There has to be some kind of release valve. And that's what this prowling around was serving.
We could psychoanalyze Glenn Loury, I suppose.
Yes, that's what we're here.
My initial response to you just a moment ago was in reaction to your question about, so how did this start?
Mm-hmm.
But the question that you're raising now is why it seems to me best illuminated by asking, why did it persist?
Right.
And as I advanced in terms of my professional accomplishment and credentialization and my identity being revised in light of my successes and my resources increasing because I graduated from MIT with the PhD. I became a professor with a professor's salary, and I started traveling. I started doing business consulting and earning an outside income, and enlarging my world. And I was no longer that kid from the south side of Chicago who was just a regular Joe. Now I was becoming something else. I was becoming the Glenn Loury PhD, the Glenn Loury accomplished professional whose peers were different, whose 9 to 5 was different, and had a certain meaning. And I'm now engaged in the activity of self-examination, self-regard, and evaluation and assessment and understanding when I say, as I do in effect in the book, that successful life wasn't enough, and I wanted more, and that guy, that person whom I had become, the respectable person, wasn't truly and authentically a Black person. And I say this with hesitation and with trepidation. And I think I acknowledge in the book that there's a sense in which this sentiment that I'm about to express is horrible. What does it mean to be really Black? That I associated in my mind subconsciously some of this line crossing behavior, some of this devil may care engagement with the streets as authenticating me somehow and keeping me from becoming one of what I call in the book the Negro cognoscenti, one of the elite, respectable, upper class, snooty, think they're better than other people, don't know anything about real life, have lost something. Again, I say with trepidation because I know it's not an entirely respectable thought, authentic about their Blackness, that there was something in the raw, visceral, immediate, earthy, forbidden, I just go on here. And I cannot be the first person to have had this thought. I'm sure if I knew the literary canon of, modern American fiction better, I'd be able to name a dozen characters who embody this kind of idea, but I can't. So I've only got my own experience to draw on.
Well, I think a lot of people will relate to it. I mean, I think anybody who has, sort of come from a different place that they ended up experiences some version of it. And I mean, and at one point, I can't remember, I think this is maybe you're back in Chicago, you're talking about your colleagues. You have Black colleagues in the academy, some of whom are married to white women. And you say, at that time, I had a white wife problem.
Yeah.
So you didn't like to see Black men with white wives. Can you say more about that?
Well, it's true. I confess that because, I had a white wife problem. Accomplished Black men marrying out of the race. And some of it was just straight up racism. I think you'd have to say in retrospect, it was that I thought that was a kind of betrayal. And more than that, I had this opposition between women's claiming, feminists claiming for equality and respect, and transformation of the historical roles and statuses of women, liberation on the one hand, and Black aspiration and seeking of freedom and equality and liberation on the other. I resented the easy appropriation of the moral authority of the Black freedom struggle as I understood it. And those years, we're talking about the 1970s. 60s and 70s, appropriation of the moral authority of the Black freedom struggle on behalf of claims that women were making in their own interest, when I thought they're going to turn around and marry white men and form white families and live in white communities and enjoy the benefits of white society. And that's something that's foreclosed to Black people so that their supposed opposition to patriarchy is really less than it's made out to be, because at the end of the day, they're in solidarity around the domestic compromise and partnerships that they are forming with white men, and have access to what I came to call social capital. This would have been later.
Right.
But no, actually, at the time that I was teaching in Chicago, had already written my dissertation, and I used the term social capital, by which I simply meant the kinds of resources that foster people's development, but that are available only as a consequence of their connections to other people. And families are venues in which people connect in ways that enhance the development of family members that are not generally available to those who are on the outside. And intra-racial intimacy, which is the main way in which people, men and women, hook up, meant that white women were advantaged in a way that Black people could never hope to be. This is the kind of thing I go on at some length only because you've asked me to explain something that might seem very strange.
Yeah, no, I mean, it makes logical sense. I understand the logic of that.
Such was the thinking of a 30-year-old kid.
Well,
yeah.
I mean, and at the same time, your first wife, Charlene, did not have the social capital that you did. And, you have these very poignant scenes where you talk about being in Boston with her and bringing her to parties, and, they're playing John Coltrane, and they're playing, there's art on the walls, and it's sophisticated,
right.
Kind of intellectual scene, and she doesn't know what to do with it. And I think that's a very relatable kind of experience for people on both sides. People can relate to being in her position and in your position. I want to talk about your second wife, Dr. Linda Doucher Loury. She was an economist as well.
Yes.
And she's somebody who could keep up at those parties.
Well, yeah, that's true. Let me just say about Charlene, my first wife, she was 15 when she became pregnant with Lisa, 16 when Lisa was born. She dropped out of high school. She did not have a lot of polish. I was the one going to classes at Northwestern University and reading about existentialism and phenomenology and Goethe and, whatnot. And she was home taking care of 2 kids. And by the time we get to graduate school, and she is a secretary working a 9 to 5, and I'm going to classes with the most promising young economists in the world, we might find ourselves in one of those mansions on Brattle Street at a cocktail party, and the European sophisticates would be talking about high culture, and we'd be hanging on by our fingernails, except that, of course, I was more like one of them by a long shot than she, and we experienced those evenings really quite differently, and that's what you were referring to. But yes, our marriage didn't survive, and we separated in my second year in the PhD program. And Linda came along in my third year as a new graduate student in economics at MIT, an African-American woman from Baltimore, a working class family in Baltimore. We hit it off and became friends and lovers. And ultimately, we married some years later. But yeah, we formed a lifelong bond. She passed away in 2011 after a decade of fighting metastatic breast cancer.
You had an extraordinary intellectual partnership with Linda, and you write very movingly about your marriage, and you have 2 sons with her. But again, you have this double life. And actually, before we get to this particular period, we should say that in addition to the 2 daughters you have with Charlene, you have a son, Alden Loury, that was conceived this was not even a relationship, really. And you, I think you did your best to send money and support him financially as much as you could, but you had no relationship with him. So we should say you go into the marriage with Linda, and now you're sort of like I don't know if we call you a power couple, but you're living a very upper middle class, just a very different kind of life than you ever lived before. You've got this whole backstory, but you are making a life together, and you're still going out at night. What was that like for you at that time? Like, did you even think about what you were doing, or did it feel more like a reflex?
Oh, well, I didn't think very long about what I was doing, because if I had done it, the thinking, I might not have done the doing. I was hell-bent on doing the doing. I try to develop this theme in the book because it extends before she and I are married and living together in Cambridge, as me, a professor at Harvard, and her at Tufts. Before that, when we were dating and we were cohabitating, but we weren't married, and we were kind of committed to each other, but not entirely so. I mean, she was certainly monogamous, and as far as I know, in our relationship, but I was not. And she kind of knew that I wasn't, that I was fooling around a little bit, that I'd go on business trips and, there'd be charges on my credit card that if you were to interrogate me, I'd have a hard time explaining, but she never did interrogate me. That's one of the themes that I try to work with in my description of my relationship with my late wife, Linda. That is the one in which we have mutual knowledge of my infidelity, which we're not making explicit in our interaction with one another, and wherein I'm taking her not making it public and common between us, her knowledge of my infidelity, as de facto tacit endorsement of it, or an acceptance of my exploitation of my power in the relationship, which is that I knew that she wouldn't leave and I knew I could get away with doing this. And it's something that I wanted to do. And I'm, I try to be anyway. I don't know, the reader can tell me, unflinching and honest with myself about that arguably scandalous behavior on my part. You're asking about origins, and again, we could put me on the couch and we could see what we learn. What I do is point to the influence that my mother's brothers, Adler, Cartman, and Alfred Cartman, these were my mother's two older brothers. Auntie Lois was the oldest. There were four of them in my mother's family growing up: her older sister, Lois, and her older brothers, Adler and Alfred. And these guys were really notorious womanizers. Alfred, indeed, was a polygamist. He had overlapping families with whom he had multiple children.
Yeah, he had
women.
22 children by four women.
Altogether,
Did I read
22.
that right?
22
by only
altogether.
Four women. Okay, wow. 22 children.
They were the 12 Roses, the Magnificent Seven, the Dynamic Duo, and the Lone Ranger. That's what these kids, they had four different mothers, came to call themselves later on when they formed something called the Cartman Connection, which was his direct descendants. When he had his 70th birthday party, there was a group photo taken with all of his direct descendants, and there were more than 100 individuals in the photo. These are children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren.
Wow.
So this was Alfred. Now, his brother Adler had no children as far as I know, but he was a profligate consumer of the delicacies and niceties of the company of the opposite sex. And they loved him. Women simply flocked to him. I tell the story in the book, just in passing, that my aunt, his sister, Lois, was the president of a social club at our church, which consisted of women. They called themselves the Sorelits, Social, Religious, Literary Guild of the Bethel African Methodist Episcopal Church. And there were a dozen of them. And Adler is rumored to have slept with half of them at one point or another. Such were his charms. Now, I wanted to be like these guys when I was an adolescent.
Yeah.
Adler once took me aside and he said, in effect, I don't know if you remember that scene from Little Miss Sunshine when the Alan Arkin character tells the grandson, get as much, as you can. That's the meaning of life. Don't die without, don't. If you have the opportunity, you should seize that opportunity. Okay. And that was definitely his attitude. And a lot of that rubbed off on me. So I'm not making an excuse as much as I'm simply describing the rich complexity of this world that nurtured me when I was a youngster coming along. And I carried some of that. I used this device I call the player in the book. He's a type. He's slick. He's a gamer. He is a hustler. It could be in a pool hall. It could be, in the bar room or whatever. He gets what he wants. He's a master of whatever the craft is at hand. He's a player. And in the sphere of getting as much as I can, I aspire to be a player.
Well, and we should also say your mother, I think she was married 4 times. Her
Yes.
big advice to you was deny everything, right?
Well,
So
yeah.
when caught, deny everything.
I see you read closely. I do mention that in passing, that she took me aside one time and, she said, if you're caught, never admit to the thing. I don't care what they tell you they saw, what they think they know, just deny it. They don't want to believe it. Just give them a reason to not believe it, was her advice to me. And I remark in the book, I said, I'm sure she meant well. The main point is that she thought that was advice that I was going to need. The normalization of the infidelity as simply a part of what people do, and not condemnatory, not shameful, simply an aspect of life. And by the way, if you're going to go that way, and I expect you will, this is advice that you should have. Deny everything. And I made good use of that advice.
Mm-hmm. And she meant that in the context of a relationship or marriage, like not necessarily deny everything to the cops, but to a woman.
She's talking about you get caught. Somebody calls at the wrong hour of the day, and then they hang up, and the wife suspects, and no, it's a coincidence.
Yeah. I was so fascinated by Linda. So the kind of inciting incident, or the first example that you cite of her getting wise to your transgressions, was when you're going to go on a trip, and she thinks it's a business trip, and you go into back when they had travel agents. And so she drops you off in front of the travel agent. And anyway, she ends up noticing that you have 2 tickets, you and somebody else. And it's obvious that she's noticed, but she makes the choice in that moment not to say anything. And I have to say, as a woman reading this, my first thought is that's a power move on her part, because now she has power over you.
Well, as I go on to say in that passage, whatever game we're playing, Linda and I, she knows more about its rules than I do.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, I agree with you 100% that I know women may have many complicated things to say about this kind of a situation, but that's how I experienced it. I experienced it as, now I know she saw that ticket and she's not saying anything. I'm kind of at a loss to understand completely what's going on, but I'm sure she knows what she's doing.
But did that make it worse for you? Like, I have to say, there was a lot in this book. I kind of feel like this is very counterintuitive maybe, but I kind of feel like telling younger women to read this, because I feel like we learn a lot about the male psyche. The same way that, like, when I was reading a lot of Philip Roth novels, I'm about to compare you to Philip Roth, okay? So just get ready. When I was reading a lot of Philip Roth novels when I was younger, I know now we're supposed to be all offended by this, and this is no longer allowed. But my feeling was like, I'm learning about men here. Like, this is an incredible education. Like, aside from the incredible literary experience, just, the kind of writer he was, like, this gives me a lot of insight. And I wonder, like, if in that moment she had not played her cards so close to her chest, if she had made a scene or confronted you or something, would that have been an easier situation for you than the way she did things?
I don't know. It would have made me make a choice. She would have been laying down a marker, and I would have had to decide what was important to me. As it was, she didn't. Now, was it easier for me to be able to avoid having to decide what was important to me? Well, maybe in the moment, so yeah, but perhaps in the fullness of retrospect, I was the worse for that, because the behavior continued to the detriment of our relationship, and ultimately to my own personal detriment in very severe ways. And I put something at risk. I put at risk what ultimately became a very fruitful union between us, both in terms of my personal development and the 2 children to whom she gave birth, Glenn the second and Nehemiah, who are in their 30s now and are magnificent human beings, in large part because of her nurturing. I mean, I was there as well, but I put all that at risk. And so with the wisdom of my many years, I can look back on it and say I'm probably much better off that I didn't lose her in that travel agency with her saying, "Who the hell are you going on that trip with?" And with me saying, "None of your goddamn business."
Mm. So your behavior got even more and more, let's just say, transgressive. So you're in the marriage with her. This is the period, you're sneaking out. You're sleeping with a lot of women. At one point, you have a mistress who we now know is Pamela Foster. You name her in the book. She's named in several news accounts.
Yeah.
You end up having an affair. You cheat on your mistress with somebody else. And which is quite impressive. And then you're into drugs and you're smoking crack cocaine. I mean, this reaches a level. It's cinematic, really. And we can get into the details. As much as is it's actually that kind of stuff is interesting. But what's more interesting to me is the way Linda forgives you over and over again. And it's as if she has made, not as if, she has clearly made a conscious choice to hold on to you no matter what. And we should say this is a woman who is a professor of economics. She's a tough. She has her act together in a million ways. If we looked at you guys from the outside, you would be, pillars of your community. You would be, a marriage that people looked up to, that wanted to emulate. And I found myself wondering if, as a Black woman, as a high-level professional Black woman, she kind of did the math and said, I need to hold on to this marriage no matter what, because this is somebody who is my intellectual equal, and maybe I'm unlikely to find that if I lose him.
That's a very plausible speculation on your part. After she died, one of my students, Roland Frier, I can name him. Roland is a famous economist at Harvard now, but at the time he was a graduate student and I was working with him. He was at Penn State University doing a PhD. I was at Boston University, but I had met him at a conference and liked him and brought him in for a summer at Boston University at my institute that I was running there. And we had kind of bonded and we started doing research together. And he was around a lot and he got to know Linda very, very well. And she unfortunately expired after a struggle with breast cancer. And he had by then become a professor at Harvard, Roland, and was there at the memorial service and told a story. And I'm saying all of that to set up the story. So the story is Roland is recalling Linda. She's now gone. We're at Tufts University's departmental memorial service for her. And he was extolling her virtues. And one of them, in addition to being a very fine economist, meticulous in her handling of data, imaginative in the questions that she was asking, productive in her resume and so on, she was someone who was loyal, he said. And he told the story of going to her. They had met for lunch one day. I wasn't there. And he and I were on the outs because I was berating him for being too stupid to see the answer to this question and making the same mistake over and over again, kind of drill sergeant teaching as a professor and him a graduate student, trying to exhort him to be his best. Now, I was very tough on him and was getting to him. And he went to her and confessed it. He says, I don't know if I can take it. And she says something to him like, Glenn can be unbearable sometimes, but he's absolutely brilliant. You won't regret sticking with him. She said something like that to him, and he recounted that story in the aftermath of her passing. She was loyal to me to a fault and was deeply invested in the relationship that she and I had developed together, and perhaps the calculation that you allude to, well, if I leave this guy, what's there for me? What's my next best option is a calculation that she made. I mean, I shouldn't be the one to say this, but I was a good catch. No, warts and all.
That's what I'm saying. I was not suggesting that was the only reason she stayed with you. I was just wondering if there's like if this maps onto some kind of economic logic, or like if you both as economists, there was something playing out that had to do with the mating economy and, the racial politics of it and just the nature of men and women and
That's exactly the
educated
way
people.
we,
Yeah.
we used to call it search theory. There's a whole theory in economics. It has to do with jobs, not partnerships, but you could apply the same logic. Do I quit this job and look for another one, or do I stick with this? And I have to take into account my anticipation of how well will I do if I go back out and search. And I have to compare that to how well am I doing with the current thing and taking the risk and all on board. There's a decision calculus about whether to search or whether to stay. And that logic applies, I think, very clearly and directly to that. But of course, those kinds of intimate behaviors are not just logical choices. They're
Yeah.
also emotional expressions.
Yeah. So I've been asking a lot of personal questions. We haven't talked about your political journeys. I guess they are plural. So you started off a kind of just, standard issue liberal. Then you sort of drifted into conservatism. Then you were liberal again, conservative again.
Yeah.
That was really interesting. I mean, your changing of mind, it correlates with the changes in the culture, right? So like liberalism doesn't mean the same thing, or at least the left doesn't mean the same thing today that it did 40 years ago. I don't know exactly what I'm asking. As I think I discovered you in your talks with John McWhorter. You were talking about, I think I found you guys on Blogging Heads around 2013 or so. And, as I've written, you were talking about racial politics with the same critique that I was thinking about women's issues. So like I always consider myself a sort of, standard issue, second wave feminist. But I did not like the way the current feminist movement was going. I didn't like the victimology. I didn't like the sort of weaponized performative oppression, all this kind of stuff. And you guys really gave me permission to speak out loud about my troubles with this discourse.
You're welcome.
Yeah, so thank you. How has it been? I mean, we sort of know, you talk a lot about the penalties that you have paid for not towing the line, not saying the expected thing. And you're very honest about the opportunities that you were given because you were Black, because of these, liberal initiatives. And I think that, part of what people like about you and John so much is that you're really intellectually rigorous with yourselves. You're willing to kind of engage in your own conflict. And like I said before, sort of cognitive dissonance around this. When Me Too rolled around, for instance, I know you guys were not talking about that much, but when we sort of entered the, for lack of a better term, era of wokeness, I'm wondering what you were thinking about your own personal history, and if you had any fear that you were going to be sort of Me Too'd all over again. I mean, you were caught very publicly, but you were never kind of brought up, in front of judge and jury, in the way that so many other people have been in the last few years.
I didn't. Maybe I should have fear that chickens were going to come home to roost, or that skeletons were going to tumble from a closet, or some other such horrible metaphor.
Mhm.
That my past would catch up with me, in part because the fiasco with Pamela Foster had been so public, widely known and discussed, and almost defining for me in a way that, I mean, what more could they say? I mean, yes, I had many affairs. No, I never had one with someone with whom I was working or had, as a student or something, that it could be said I exploited my work position on behalf of my sexual interest. But I had certainly been involved in many relationships with women that, if these things were to known they have been public, if I were running for office somewhere and, suddenly, what did the Clinton people call them, Bimbo eruptions, during the 1992 campaign. I'm not making that up. That's George Stephanopoulos or
I
James
never heard
Carville or
that.
somebody.
Oh, that's good.
That's a real term. I didn't make that up.
Bimbo eruptions. That'd be a good name for somebody's podcast. Maybe Sarah and I should change our name on our other podcast. Yeah.
I didn't. I had feelings about Me Too, and I don't want to get in trouble by saying what they are, but I'll just say I thought, there's some real issues with the Harvey Weinsteins and people. And not only that, the most egregious cases, yes, the women have a point here. On the other hand, I thought it's complicated. I thought the dynamic between men and women is subtle, and the accusatory tone and the kind of black and white moralism of this movement obscures some things that I think are just a part of the, quote, battle of the sexes, the way they used to call it back in the day, thing that goes on. And it's not all just black and white. And, women are not completely without resources or power in many of these circumstances, and so on and so forth. Something I think I saw reiterated, and something that you wrote somewhere, if I'm not mistaken.
Oh, yeah. No, women often have more power. I mean, power is fluid, right? It's shifting all the time. It's like, women, that moment where Linda doesn't say anything to you, like I just said, she had a strange kind of power in that moment. And I would argue that she had a real power throughout your marriage, even though it might not have seemed that way if you looked at it in the most simplistic terms, but she might have had the ultimate power.
So anyway, I didn't experience Me Too as a personal threat. It did raise in my mind some questions as I saw what might be called a moral panic to some degree proceed under what I certainly thought was a overly simplified moralism that didn't come fully to terms with the subtleties of the male-female interaction in various venues. I thought there were questions to be raised, but no, I didn't worry that my past was going to catch up with me.
What do you think you would have done if you were starting out now, though? Like you could never have gotten away with this if you had been born in 1970 or 1980, as opposed to when you were born and when you came of age.
Yeah, I have no idea what to say to that. I can't put myself in the position of a person who was raised in a completely different cultural matrix. Who would I have been then? I would have been certainly a different person. I can speculate, but it would only be speculation. I'd be much more circumspect, much more fearful that the correspondence, the text messages, because they didn't have text messages in 1985, but I've been seen someplace, my photograph somewhere. I mean, I can't go incognito,
right. Well, and you would have people going after you. I mean, as a conservative, you've already got a target on your back among a certain crowd. Anyway, they do want to see you fail. I'm curious, the book, this is published by Norton. This is, regular old legacy, elite media publisher. What were your conversations like with your editor? Did you get any pushback, or was anybody saying to you, hey, maybe you don't want to include all this stuff?
Well, therein lies a tale. I'm not sure how much of it to tell. I don't know what the rules are here. I first want to mention my agent, Don Fair of the Trident Group, which represents writers, and he's a distinguished literary agent, and he has a close relationship over the years cultivated with John Glussman, who is senior editor at Norton. Now, I'm turning in chapters along the way because the book is overdue, because, and so I didn't submit the manuscript. I did ultimately submit the manuscript as a whole piece. Here it is. But as a way of vouchsafing that I was making regular progress on producing something that was long past due and had a couple of deadlines extended, I was sharing drafts along the way of chapters with my agent and with my editor. And we were interacting. And John was like saying, really? When I would describe some of the escapades, especially in regard to my treatment of Linda, his eyebrows were firmly raised. Really? And when I would give my pat account oh, my uncles were womanizers and they had a big influence on me when I was a kid. And I always grew up with this idea of what a real man was. And a real man was one who got as much what as he could. And I was going to get as much what as I could. QED, end of story. He's like saying, wait, man, that's way too pat. Way too pat. And I noticed that you don't accept any responsibility for any goddamn thing. Not a quote, but the sentiment that, in his comment. And he forced me to get beyond some of my cover story stuff and to get real about what was going on. So there are passages in the book where I say things like, this is not a quote, but this is the essence of it. What was I doing to that good woman who was standing by me? Oh, I see. I didn't have the courage when I was involved in this torrid affair with Pamela Foster to actually tell her I wanted out of the marriage. I was going to make it so obvious to everybody walking up and down the avenue who saw me and Pamela strolling in Harvard Square together that the word would get back to her and she would have to take the responsibility of actually lancing the boil here. I wanted out of the marriage, but I didn't want to stand up and be a man and tell her that I did. I wanted her to break it off out of humiliating her in public, in effect, by prancing around with this woman. Things like that. That's in the book, largely because John Glussman raised his eyebrows at the pat accounts that I was giving in early drafts.
Did you know that about yourself before he invited you to think about it?
Yeah, I knew it, but I wasn't owning up to it in the Confessions of a Black Conservative. I wasn't really confessing fully to what I knew. I mean, there's another passage where I say, I have my rationalizations, but you might just write this off as the self-serving presumptions of an entitled pig. I basically call myself an entitled pig. I mean, I try to do so in a manner that gives the reader a way of saying, well, at least he's recognizing this about himself. Maybe he's not so bad after all. But hell, what was it? What was I really in those years in that relationship? But someone so narcissistic. And this is also true, and I acknowledge it about some of my relationships with my children, where I didn't acknowledge Alden, not really, until he was a grown man. I now have a wonderful relationship with him and his 3 daughters, but it took decades. I, in effect, abandoned my daughters, Lisa and Tamara, Charlene, and my 2 children, because when the marriage broke up and I moved off to my career as a high-flying economist, I was living in a different city, and I didn't see very much of them, and I didn't cultivate the kind of close relationship between my daughters and their father that my aunt Elois warned me when I told her about the dissolution of my marriage to Charlene. I must do. She took me aside and she made a point of saying, you have to make those girls know that you love them on a daily, weekly, monthly basis. Yeah. You must never forget about it. You must send them flowers. You must write them love notes. You must go and visit. You must take them with you when you go to Europe. I didn't really do that, not nearly as much as I knew that my Auntie Lois meant that I should do, so that they would know their own value as young women from seeing the way in which their father anointed them as princesses. And I fell short of that. And those are some of the things that I came to know about myself. You asked me, did I learn from Glussman's reprimand that I was being not honest with myself? And yeah, but I kind of already knew, but he forced my hand.
You called the book Confessions of a Black Conservative. Are you winking a little bit there? Because, depending on your definition of conservative, your life is, your personal life is anything but conservative. I mean, we're talking about hookers and cocaine and mistresses upon mistresses and, extremely, the kind of thing that one would point to the hypocrisy of conservatives. But at root, you have a conservative sensibility, even if your actions utterly belie that. Where did that subtitle come from?
Oh, well, the subtitle came from the process by which a title was arrived at. Late Admissions, Confessions of a Black Conservative. Now, how was the title arrived at? Because the original title that I came in with was the enemy within.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and that is another trope or device that I exploit in the narrative of the book, talking about the struggle for self-command, the opposition between the me who would do right and the me who wants to give in to my lusts and my urges, the me who would tell the truth about a complicated political question, a controversial question, and the me who would shade a little bit one way or the other in order to maintain my viability within a certain social or professional circle or whatever. Anyway, the enemy within, the struggles within for dignity, for authenticity, for self-honesty, for self-understanding. These were themes that had been animating my thinking and that I wanted to see in the title of the book. And then the good John Glussman, whom I've mentioned, observed, he just invited me to Google the enemy within. And what I found was a library shelf full of reports from the Rand Corporation about counterterrorism.
Okay. Well, we can take that off.
And he said, see, I told you that's not a good title. It's too generic. You need another title. So what's the title? So I came up, I brainstormed this with my podcast team, Nikita Petrov and Mark Sussman, who are respectively my producer and writer at The Glenn Show and GlennLoury.substack, which is my newsletter and podcast enterprise. And I was talking with them about this one day. And we just kind of brainstormed like a couple of dozen possible titles. And I kicked it around with my friend, Larry Kotlikoff, the economist, whom I've known for 30 years and who was my best man at my wedding to my wife, my third wife, my current wife, the lovely Lawan Loury. But in any case, Larry's a writer. And, so I talked with friends and colleagues about, what could be a title. And when people had different ideas, and I generated a long list. I even went to ChatGPT and asked ChatGPT what they thought titles should. So it's a long list.
Okay.
Yeah, no,
that's desperation.
ChatGPT did not determine my title, but I had a list. And I sent it over to John and Glussman, the senior editor at Norton. And one title was Late Admissions, a Memoir. And another title was Confessions of a Black Conservative, a Memoir.
Okay.
John suggested, why don't we combine the Late Admissions as the title and the Confessions of a Black Conservative as a subtitle? And thought about that for a while, and the idea kind of grew on me, and that's what we finally agreed on.
Yeah, well, I mean, these are admissions that are coming relatively late in life. We're going to wrap up, but I do want to just mention Lawan. She seems like an absolutely delightful person. She's your wife of the last several years, or at least
7 years.
7
It'll be our
years.
7th anniversary. We were married on October 7th.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. October 7th, 2017. Our day that will live in infamy is our anniversary.
Yeah. Well, and I know that she's more liberal than you, and you have some interesting conversations over the breakfast table. I mean, we haven't talked about this stuff at all, and we are gonna wrap up in a minute. But I feel like my listeners are going to be frustrated if I don't ask you, how are you feeling about the quote unquote race discussion these days? You and John McWhorter have been talking about this stuff regularly for many, many years now. My listeners will probably be very familiar with your opinions about, public intellectuals who have 3 names and those sorts.
Yeah.
Do you think that things are getting any saner or at least less exasperating, or are we just kind of spinning our wheels here?
Oh, I get asked this question a lot, and I vacillate. On the one hand, I think from my perspective, the general consensus view about the problem amongst decent people, progressives, I don't necessarily mean hard left. I just mean people who mean well, is out of touch with reality and is full of virtue signaling and phony performative anti-racism, and doesn't come to grips with the realities of the huge social problem that the persisting marginal status of a very substantial portion of the African American population, 40%, whatever, who's in prison, who's not learning to read and write in school, who's committing violent crimes, et cetera. And that is like a black hole of intellectual irresponsibility and wishful thinking. And that the people who are in charge of the megaphone don't inspire me at all. I mean, I can find exceptions. I can find pockets of, hopeful efforts at reform. I just interviewed a pastor in Chicago, for example. Corey Brooks is his name, who runs a church and community center on the south side of Chicago. He's just one guy of, many who are doing similar kind of things. And a lot of that kind of stuff could be said. But in the professoriate, in the liberal media, in the Democratic Party, I think it's intellectually bankrupt on the race question. I could try to say more, but people can follow me, and you know what I'm talking about. On the other hand, if you were to ask me, have we passed peak woke on the racial front, on the Ibram X. Kendi, Robin DiAngelo, white fragility, how to be an anti-racist?
Woke Baby?
Yeah.
Woke Baby is an actual book, not a satire, correct?
Woke Baby.
It is. It's a real book.
Have we passed peak woke? Yeah, I think we probably have passed peak woke. And are there reasons to think that some of the limitations on freedom of expression and open discourse about some of these questions are being challenged, and that there's a backlash and a counter movement? Yeah, and I think we saw a little bit of that in the anti-DEI surge, that the concerns about anti-Semitism and reactions on campus in the aftermath of the October 7th attack by Hamas on Israel has engendered. I think that's evidence of it. But so, I could point to being past peak woke, and I could say, things are opening up a little bit. Or I could point to Benjamin Crump. This is the attorney whom Al Sharpton calls Black America's Attorney General, whose book, Open Season, which is a claim that African Americans are being hunted by police departments throughout the country. And, I think the issue of public safety is not illuminated by that kind of opportunistic rhetoric. And, I could give many examples. I think, the cognitive achievement gap, what you see as a result of test score disparities, that reflects the real disparity between populations and the acquisition of intellectual mastery over material ideas, methods, conceptions that are essential to flourishing in the modern world in the 21st century. That I think the family disparity issues, structure of African American families out of wedlock births, the nature of relations between men and women, that's the foundation of social reproduction, that's revealed by some of these statistics, that reality, and so on. I could go on. Yeah. I just interviewed Amy Wax, the notorious conservative law professor at the University of Pennsylvania.
That I think a lot of people know as your friend, Amy Wax. I think you have introduced her to more people than she would have introduced herself to. But yeah.
Okay, so that's true. And but she's been brought up on charges at the University of Pennsylvania for, undermining the integrity of the intellectual enterprise, basically for having opinions that are not dissimilar to the ones that I just got through hinting at a moment ago. And they could be wrong. But they're not implausible or, whatever. And anyway, I ramble.
Well, do you think education is broken? I am going to let you go. But I do this other podcast with Sarah Hayter, who's 20 years younger than I am. And she's very pessimistic about just everything. She's young enough so that she doesn't remember when things were better. And she thinks education is just broken, that in 20 years, there won't be any point in sending your kids to college. I'm more sanguine than that.
Gosh, I hope she's wrong. All I can say is that based on my experience with my students at Brown, they are hungry for challenging engagement with the important ideas. I teach freshmen on race and inequality. They're inquisitive. They are relatively courageous, some of them, and things are more open now on that front. We discussed, for example, the Supreme Court's affirmative action decision last summer.
Mm-hmm.
And I get arguments with students which are cool, factual, productive, useful. People change their minds. They are freer to express opinions. This is in my experience. Now, these are self-selected students. I'm a known quantity, so the ones who choose me may be different from the random draw, but they want somebody to stand up for the intellectual integrity of what it is that we're there to do, rather than proselytize and try to convert them through hectoring from the lectern about what's the righteous. These are hard problems. How do you maintain a safe city? I start one of my classes with that as the kind of governing question. The production of public safety. It's a good. How do you secure that? And that is a hard problem, not an easy problem. It's not one with people wearing black hats and white hats, and we can just figure out who the good guys are and we can stand on their side. And it's got subtleties and nuances that warrant our attention, and I find them to be responsive to that. So in my own little world of experience, I haven't given up.
I'm very glad to hear that. And I hear that from enough other people too, that I think there's a lot of hope. Well, Glenn, thank you for all of the work that you have done and are continuing to do. And thank you for writing this book. And thank you for speaking with me. It's been a wonderful conversation.
Meghan, it's been my pleasure. And I so appreciate your admiration for and your interest in my book and my life. Thank you.
Thank you. That was my conversation with the inimitable, I'm going to pronounce that correctly, economist and academic Glenn Loury. Glenn is a professor of social sciences and economics at Brown University, and you can find him on Substack at glennloury.substack.com. His new book is Late Admissions, Confessions of a Black Conservative, and it's out May 14th. If you enjoyed this conversation and you're not yet a paying subscriber, please consider becoming one. I am committed to keeping this podcast lively and surprising and free of red meat, idiomatic red meat anyway. I fully endorse literal red meat. To support it, go to megandom.substack.com, becoming paying subscriber. It gets you all kinds of perks, and you can hear the entire episode every week. I'll be back next week with another super nuanced guest. Thanks for listening. See you then.